Hi guys, welcome back. If more people join, that will be great. And if they don't, it'll also be great. So here's what I want. We sent out the link. It started with the source sheet from last week, and then the new stuff is on the bottom. So we'll go through it together. I went back and forth as to what to do. I left off at the very end. Thank you, Sarah. I left off at the very end about we didn't do the last source. But I think it actually fits into this week's stuff also. So we're going to do it now. But we're going to have to take it in a slightly different direction. So if you were not here last week, I don't know if anybody was not here last week, but if you weren't, it's totally fine because it stands on its own. But if you were, it may have some interesting resonances for you. So I will share that. Okay. So, okay, and the handout is in the chat. That's all. Okay, so we last week, just for quick recap, again, not necessary for this week. We saw a bunch of people who had maybe trouble communicating with their spouses, women who sort of, men who took vows that sort of put their wives in very precarious positions, and the wives sort of have to find a way to fulfill them so they can stay married. And one of them was this woman. The last source we talked about was a woman, sort of a man and woman with a language barrier, where she kept on, perhaps naively, perhaps like trying as a cry for help or something, sort of misunderstanding his requests, and ends up like breaking a clay sort of lamp on a rabbi's head, who then sort of gives her a bracha and maybe shows her a way, shows her and her husband implicitly a way of sort of like moving forward in their relationship without standing so much for their, being such sticklers for their own dignity and maybe thinking about the other person's dignity. Okay. So there's another story about a wife who confuses food, which is, I think I put in the discussion for today, no promises of any happy endings today. In fact, right, that's a nice way of saying lots of unhappy endings today. So I think one thing I want to hopefully model by the end is one way of trying to think about that. So we're going to have, this is a sugya about, the excerpt we have here is a series of sort of men talking about their wives, mostly in the negative, though not in the longer sugya, not only in the negative. And it, as a female reader, it always seems sort of strange. It feels like you're being brought into like this like boys club where people complain about, like the old ball and chain. So let's read that. So here. So Rav is going to be one of our major characters who has apparently a not great relationship with his wife, as we will see. So Rav have a miftar mi Rabbi Chia. He was taking leave of Rabbi Chia, apparently, when Rabbi Chia was returning to Bavel. Amarle, Rachmana litzlach mimidi dekashim imavta. And he told him this kind of cryptic message, right? May God save you from a fate worse than death, right? So this was like, so on the one hand, it's sort of like a cute or sort of, yeah, everybody would want to be saved from a fate worse than death. But what did he have in mind? So he was making a reference the Gemara wants to decide, right? Umi kamidi dekashim imavta. Is there really anything that's more, that's worse than death? Nafak dak v'ashkach. So Rabbi Chia, on his long trip back to Bavel or wherever, sort of went out and investigated, and he found a pasuk that must be what Rav was referring to. Maybe Rav had to talk in code because what he was saying was not very nice to at least one of the other people in his household. I don't know. So Rav was apparently making a somewhat cryptic reference to the following pasuk: Motzei ani mar mimavet et haisha. I find more bitter than death the woman. Right, from Kohelet. Kohelet has different things to say at different times. It's sort of like his own, the book of Kohelet is kind of his own journey, I think is one way to read it. But at some point he feels like women are worse than death, right? So Rav is saying, right, you should be saved from a woman. What kind of a wish is that for someone? I'll put it this way, right? Is he really saying, I hope you remain a bachelor forever? Maybe he's like, this was the biggest mistake of my life. But maybe he is saying like, well, as we'll see, maybe he's sort of, maybe implicit in this is an understanding that it's not all women, but I personally have found this to be the case, right? Okay, so let's see. So Rav, here's the backstory. Why would Rav say this, right? Maybe you'd be saved from a fate worse than death, i.e. a wife, right? Why would Rav speak so negatively about maybe the institution of marriage? So here, okay, I'll read it and then I'll caveat it a little bit. Rav Havakam Mitzarale Devitu. So his wife used to bug him. She was not nice to him. I once heard a recorded shiur from a well-known American rabbi from, like, you know, I think it was recorded in the 90s, where he said Rav's wife was a shrew. So I think that, and he actually had a very nice message other than that. So I guess that moment was like a form follows content moment for this sugya for me, because right, this sugya is like us getting a window into these rabbis talking amongst themselves about their wives in perhaps somewhat disparaging ways, and then you can hear contemporaries also use perhaps like not so self-aware language about it. But I when I teach this, I always like to point out, right, like this is Rav's perspective that his wife is a bad wife, right? Like it doesn't say what she did, and we don't know. Right? Like she bothered him, right? It's like, if you're bored, then you're boring, right? Like he was bothered by her might be a more accurate statement. We don't know. So like, I want to give Rav's wife like a little bit of credit here, but we'll see. So Ki Amar, here's an example of what she would do. Ki Amar la avidi le tzlufche, if he would say, make me peas, avdale chimtze, she would make him lentils. Did I just switch those? I always switch them, right? Chimtze, avdale tzlufche. And if he would say, make me lentils, she would make peas. So similar to our wife from last week, who sort of got the words maybe confused about her husband's sort of menu desires. Here, she seems to always do it backwards, okay? Like she always makes the opposite. She never gives him what he wants for dinner, and this is very sad for him. Okay, so that's sort of like, and this goes on for a long time, right? Which, I mean, how would we describe that relationship perhaps? Just knowing what we know, without any sort of like judgments about the individuals, let's say. Nobody's, it has to be a shrew, but like, how can we describe that relationship?
Adversarial?
Okay, it's adversarial, but it's kind of like a Cold War, right? Because it seems like literally every day he's like, I would love some lentils. And she's like, here, have some peas. And he's never like, why did you make me peas again? Right? It's not like the other guy who gets mad and starts to throw things and whatever, or tells her to throw things. There's just like every day, these like little niggling things between them, okay? It's a little bit dysfunctional, one might say. Okay, so Ki gadal Chia bere, when his son Chia grew up, apichle, he switched it. Who switched what?
Miriam, before you move on to the son, can I ask you what's the symbolic value of these peas and lentils? I presume there's a tremendous, we know what lentils means in the Bible and all of that. So I'm assuming that they choose, what seems to be an exceedingly minor, they're both legumes, they both do the same thing, but there must be some symbolic value in the fact that they chose to call this rather minor dispute between peas and lentils a source of tremendous aggravation for him.
Right. That's a great question. I don't know. Do you want to spell out what you're thinking in terms of lentils?
Yeah, obviously, I didn't check. The lentils is what we say that Yitzchak and Yaakov and Esav, traded the firstborn status for. I don't know if either of these words are the correct words for those. But
well, there's Nazir Anashim, but yeah, I don't know. I always, honestly, I tended to read it as just sort of like, well, that's what people ate, right? People ate like some kind of porridge, and this is what it was made of. But I think you're meaning certainly the observation that these things are actually very similar is very important, right? It's not like, give me a calf's foot and she gave him lentils, which last time was like, they're not even on the same page. It's like, it's close, but not quite there in a way that sort of increases the aggravation. In terms of the lentils and the connection to Yaakov, it's interesting. If anything, that may sort of help bring her character out a little bit as sort of the person, the baker who's having a perhaps like somewhat unreasonable request made of her, which we're going to see that maybe a little bit later.
I think also the fact that if I said to my mother, I'd like to have peas and not lentils, I wouldn't care. What's the difference? It seems to me like it's something that's easy to overlook. If he said, I want fish, and she gave him cheese, that would make a difference because maybe he's allergic to cheese. But there's such a minor difference that you see that he's being persnickety or whatever it is. He's being
maybe she doesn't even know, right? Maybe it is like she just sort of thinks of it as like he says, I want some bread, and she brings a challah roll, and he's like, oh my God, she should have known I meant rye bread, right? Like, it could be, right, that the difference is not even perceptible to her. It's
Right.
possible, although, as we'll see in the story, it seems like she knows what he really wants from what comes next.
Okay.
But okay, so Kigad, when his son grew up, he switched them, meaning his dad would say, "Go tell your mom I want lentils for dinner," and he would say, "Dad wants peas for dinner," and then she would produce lentils. Right? So it seems to be reliable that whichever one you say, she does the opposite. It's not an accident. Or not the opposite, but the other one. Okay. It also seems like in general, he doesn't have that much variety of food. I don't know. Meaning, yeah, maybe this is just an example, or maybe really like they didn't have so much variety of food in general. And maybe everyone else is kind of like, what's for dinner is what's for dinner. You know, now we talk about like, pick kids and picky eaters, and there's all sorts of ways of historicizing it. But like it used to be just like, what's for dinner is what's for dinner. And it's not like, oh, I want the dinosaur chicken instead of this kind of chicken. Like that's not a thing, right? So it's not a thing in our house either. Your mother, don't worry. Well, a little bit. So, right, like there's something, I think, if you read it from the perspective of the person who prepares the food, there is something a little bit unreasonable in Rav's like requests. I'll give you that, but it does seem like she's being very dafka. Like there's something happening here that's not an accident. So So Chia thinks that he's fixed the problem, right? His dad gets what he wants, and his mom, they didn't have to talk about it at all, right? This is the best way to solve a marital problem. Nobody had to talk to each other about it at all. They just solved the problem with this little technical fix, right? Okay, so Amar le iyalach lach ima, right? So Rav said to his son, "Oh, your mother has improved." Query whether, okay. Amar le anahu daka pichel. He's like, actually, it was me. Father, I cannot tell a lie. It was me. I've been switching peas and lentils this whole time. Okay? Amarle, Hainu Dekamra. So Rav has two reactions almost. The first reaction is Hainu Dekamra in She Denafik Minach Tama Melfach, right? This is what people mean when they say, you learn from your own children. Okay. And also, but you shouldn't do that. Meaning that was a great idea. However, you shouldn't do that. And here's why. Limdu l'shanam shenemar limdu l'shanam davar sheker. Sorry, like there's a pasuk in Yirmiyahu which is criticizing Bnei Israel for all the terrible things they do, and one of them. So some of it is about their lying, but here he seems to be picking on specifically the phrase limdu l'shonam davar sheker, right? That they've taught themselves to lie. It's not just that they're lying in order to steal stuff from people and other bad things. They've sort of practiced the art of lying, maybe by lying about minor stuff. So you shouldn't lie about minor stuff because that's going to sort of bring you into the category of liars, and you don't want to be a liar because that leads down a bad road. Okay.
So Miriam, why did the Rav Chia feel comfortable lying to his mother but not to his father? In other words, he should just not have told his father, and then it would have been better. There was no need to engage in this.
Right. I think it's very interesting. Right. I think that like through this story, the mother is kind of othered in some way, right? She's kind of like this inscrutable force, and the men are kind of like ganging up trying to solve it. So on the one hand, like the son seems to perceive himself as on his father's team in a way that he doesn't on his mother's team, right?
But also she was in some way engaging in like some little civil disobedience in order to make maybe perhaps some kind of a point, and now she's been actually stripped of that agency.
Right. So I think, right, exactly, that like it seems like she's doing this on purpose, and her preferred solution was clearly not my son will lie to me and the two of them will gang up on me, right? Like that would presumably not be what she wanted. So I think but that I think strengthens the idea that there is some sense of like them ganging up on her, and she's kind of, if we, the reader, want to sort of think about her for a moment, maybe that dynamic gives us a clue as to why she's doing this to begin with even, right? Which is that like, there's some sense in which she's really not listened to. Now, like, there's always sort of a, if you try a little trick to get listened to and it doesn't work, should you keep doing it for 10 years? I don't know. That also doesn't seem like the best solution, but I think that like, yeah, it's not, again, like, I don't know that like the original meaning of this text is really trying to foreground her experience, but I think it's not that far below the surface. If that's fair. Yeah. Rafi.
But also it's a problem with the son, Chia, because he's sort of triangulated between the parents. He's not a child. He has to sort of solve their problems.
Right. I think like from our perspective, part of the dysfunction is that the son is put in the middle. And when the father is like, right, when the father says your mother has improved, to me, that's kind of like you know, like, tell your mom I want lentils for dinner is like fine. It's like, get me my newspaper. It's like a household task. But like when he says your mother has improved, he's kind of brought her in on his side in a way that's inappropriate.
Right.
And in some ways, he misses a teaching moment. He uses this as a teaching moment about lying, but he misses a teaching moment about like a family situation. Okay.
And
so, yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, just reading ahead, it looks like when it talks about Rabbi Chia's wife, right? It looks like, you know, he has problems in his marriage, you know,
right.
coming from kind of a dysfunctional family.
Right. It seems like these things replicate themselves. And yeah, I think it's kind of, it problems, but not the same. So let's see it for a second. Else, did you still want to say something, Rafi? Or are you?
Yeah, I just felt like I want to say like I kind of felt like what the son does was very clever, and I kind of felt like maybe by doing this he might get his parents to just be nicer to each other, because he feels like, maybe Rebbe Chia feels like his wife is being nicer to him or something like that. I guess like maybe like he's trying to create more like shalom bayit in his house.
Right. This feels for those
like
who are
pressure
familiar
of
with
the child to like try to fix their parents' relationship.
Right. Even before the father says like, oh, your mother has improved, he's already in a position that's inappropriate for the child, perhaps, right? Which is like the peacemaker. But in some ways, right, if you think about it, for those who know the Midrash about Aharon, he's Ohev Shalom v'Rodef Shalom. And how does he do that? Right. People are fighting and he basically lies to them to get them in a room together so they can make up. Right. So like whenever you teach that, I would say don't try that at home necessarily, right? Like don't try lying to people to trick them to get them into a room together and hope that they'll be happy about it, because they might really not, right? But right, it seems like in some ways the son is doing that, and it's not clear that that itself is the problem. It's more that like he's in the wrong position to do that. Okay. So Rabbi Chia, so now we're going to move on. So it seems like, right, so like then Rav just went back to eating the wrong thing for the rest of his life. The wrong thing, right? The thing that he did not want. Okay, so that's like I would call that an unhappy ending, or certainly a non-happy ending. I don't know. Is there like, I don't know. Let's set aside right the meaning for a minute. So now Rabbi Chia, Hava Kamatzar Le Davidu, his wife also used to bother him, right? Or he used to be bothered by his wife, depending on your perspective, right? But right here, so the previous time, Rav's wife would bother him, and what followed is the story of how she bothered him, right? Here follows the story of how Rabbi Chia acted despite that, okay? All right, when he would find something nice in the market, he would kind of put it in his pocket and bring it home for her, okay? Amar le Rav, so Rav, who's like, she's so annoying to you. Why are you doing that, right? So Rav is kind of like, you know, doesn't get it. He's like, if you have an adversarial relationship with your wife, just like lean into that adversarial thing. Don't be nice to her, right? Amarle, dagenu shemigadlot banenu umasilot otanu min hachet. He said, it's enough for us that they, so this again, right, as a female reader, this is a strange thing to read, right? Dagenu, it's enough that they raise our children and save us from sin. Meaning,
satisfy their sexual urges.
Right. Women are really important, because if we didn't have women, we would have to change the diapers, and also we would be, you know, sleeping with people we weren't married to and otherwise sinning sexually. So like, great. So meaning, okay.
Yeah, but at least he could see her point of view. He brought her something that he knew she liked.
Right. So I would say on the one hand, he has what seems to us to be like a pretty constricted view of marriage, maybe, right? Or of his marriage, right? But on the other hand, he gets that like her sole purpose in life is not actually to torment him, right? She has other things going on, and those things are of value to him, right? And he's sort of trying to recognize that. So in some ways, I think that like whatever the backstory is to the adversarialness between Rabbi Chia and his wife, his reaction, I think, is kind of, it's put forward here as almost like the tikkun to Rav of like, Rav, maybe you should have tried that. Maybe you should have tried saying thank you when she brought you the peas, even though it's not what you asked for, and then see what happens, right? Whereas like Rabbi Chia does kind of try that, and then it seems like that's sort of, maybe it's always hard to know like what the text thinks, but it seems to me like that's sort of better, right? This is a better outcome. And it's true, it kind of disparages wives in general to get there. But it's kind of undercut the idea that, like, you know, your wife is worth in death, for example, right? Like, actually, not really. She also has valuable properties, even from a sort of like misogynistic perspective, let's say.
Again, in the
So
role
also-
of teaching his father, right? I mean, it's like the first time around, he's turning around and telling his father, he's making a point to his father.
Right, assuming that's the same Rabbi Chia, which I am so far, right? Like, yeah, he's sort of, even though it seems like dysfunction is running in the family, there's some amount of, maybe because, right, he tried to be the peacemaker up above, he's in the correct position to be the peacemaker, right? And he's trying that here. I don't know.
So there's also the question I'm asking is, who's narrating these stories? First of all, I mean, are they narrated by the same person or by different people? And clearly the men who are involved in this, if we take this as a narrative as opposed to a God, you know, God made the stories up, somebody had to tell those stories about their own marriages to someone else who then wrote them down. And so these are very intimate things that they're talking about here. And it's, you know, for me, interesting that that's what these somebodies told these stories to somebody else about their own marriages.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, it could be, some of them could have been sort of, there is like a whole trend in the Gemara, right? Of like, every tiny thing that you observe in your rabbi's household becomes like a little statement in the Gemara, right? Like, I once saw him eat with a fork. What does that mean, right? So, you know, some of this could come from people's observations, right? Or outside their third party.
This is the kind of thing that, I mean, even if the student, I mean, I cannot imagine that the students were absorbed. This seems to me beyond the using the fork. I understand the idea of being a Rav Mavchok or whatever it is, but this is a very intimate conversations about someone's marriage that only they could have told you.
Right. It feels like if there's one speaker here, it might be Rabbi Chia himself, right? Who sort of like was once holding forth about, you know, like marriage experience. You never believe what my uncle told me once, or like, you know, when I was growing up, I tried this, but my father told me not to. And the second thing seems to be, right, like did somebody observe the conversation between Rav and Rabbi Chia, or did they kind of tell people about it afterwards? It is very sort of, I agree, I think intimate is a good word, right? Like, there's something very intimate about it, and there's something, it's in some ways, because you're two in the family, there's nothing, it's like not, there's no nice packaged message, right? You're just sort of like observing this thing, you're like, what am I supposed to do with that?
It's almost like the story Rav Chia would have told his own children. This is the story of my father's marriage, don't do it. And this is the story of my marriage, it's not great, but it's better. It's like, there's almost like a story that's told of another story. Anyway, it's the narration aspect of this is, for me, very interesting.
Yeah, no, and I think, you know, from a somewhat,
To me, it sounds like Instagram. To me, it sounds like Instagram, like people are just oversharing, and men overshare private details that they should simply not be sharing.
Right. I think there is that. I think it's also meaning, like, from a critical perspective, right? Have a commentarily to, right? Like the fact that there are shared phrases between them maybe suggests like some amount of editing that put these stories together, where I don't know if they were originally together or not, like whose voice it is. But yeah, it does feel like Rabbi Chia is kind of like the thread, and from his perspective, you can maybe see a little bit of a development in a nice way. So one thing we're going to come back to for maybe the second half is this question of women saving us from sin. And what happens when your primary attitude is that, like, your marital intimate relationship is the locus of either sin or not sin, right? What happens when that's the frame that you look at it through? So there's a few stories I think that are really great about that. So we'll get there. And then we have sort of two Makri la Rabbi Yehuda la Rabbi Yitzchak B'rei, right? So Rabbi Yehuda taught his son. So again, we have sort of like rabbis teaching their sons about family, about sort of oversharing about their family relationships. Although this one feels a little more intentionally didactic and maybe in a way that might have a positive message. So Rabbi Yehuda bar Yitzchak, Rabbi Yehuda taught Rabbi Yitzchak his son, Motzeani mami mavet taisha, right? Our pasuk that we started with, I find women more bitter than death. Amarle kigun man. So his son is like how? Right? I don't know how old the son is. I feel like the story works better if the son is like a little bit young, so he's asking kind of like an impertinent question. Man, kigun imech, like your mama, right? Right, like you know, your mother causes me so much bitterness, right? V'hamani la Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Yitzchak b'rei ein adam motzei korat ruach ela me'ishto rishona, right? But also, Rabbi Yehuda told Rabbi Yitzchak his son, a man only finds sort of like peace of mind with his first wife, right? The wife of his youth. The Rambam writes very like, you know, poetically about that, right? Sort of his first wife, Shnei Amar, Yehi Mekorcha Baruch, L'samach Me'eshin Nerach, right? Like your sort of source should be blessed and you should be happy with the wife of your youth. V'amarle, and the son, Rabbi Yitzchak, said to him, Kigon man, like who? And he said, Kigon imech, like your mother. Okay? So like this juxtaposition to me feels like actually, right, he's trying to be honest, right? He's not oversharing. They may be oversharing with us, right? But he's not oversharing with his son because his son is in the house and knows what's happening. And he knows that sometimes they drive each other crazy and sometimes they love each other. Or maybe they always love each other, but they also drive each other crazy. I don't know, however you want to frame it. I don't know which of those things describes it, right? But like, right, and then the Gemara sort of tries to make them fit together. Oh, well, like she was very sort of harsh, but she was also easy to appease. Again, sort of putting it all on her, the way it describes it. But if you think about it, right, the point is maybe they had sort of a dramatic relationship, but it had ups and downs. So, right, in some ways, this feels to me, well, I don't know. How do you feel on the oversharing front about this story? What do you think, Rafi?
I think it's definitely, I just wanted to echo what somebody said earlier, like these definitely don't feel like vulnerable. Like it doesn't feel like the rabbis are like sharing and like trying to be vulnerable and think about their relationships in like a serious way. They're just kind of like talking about their wives as, I don't know.
Right, meaning it's always sort of on her, right? Like everything that could be different is about her. Like how easily does she get angry and does she cook the right stuff and whatever. I hear that, and I think that that's somewhat true. But I think here again, because it's a father and son, and he's right, it could be like this, like your mother, kind of like again, the kind of like they're on the same team against her. But it could also be right because if you look at the psukim, motzei ani marmim, I find right. Or be happy with the wife of your youth, right? That it's actually about the perspective of the man as well, right? Where he's saying like, I have both of these experiences with the same person, right? And like, maybe you will too, right? And maybe even he's trying to say like, that's okay. Okay, so.
Excuse me, do we have to assume that any of this took place? I mean, couldn't someone be, and not one person for all of them, but couldn't these be little agadot for which they use well-known rabbis to play certain roles to get across certain messages? It doesn't mean it actually took place, because it's kind of hard to think someone was standing there listening to all this.
Right, unless it's like himself who tells the story. So I think, listen, I don't know, like the historicity of these little Maisalach in the Gemara. I'm not honestly committed either way. Certainly, like they do seem to be edited well in a way that presumably like they're not always, certainly not verbatim. And yeah, like it's possible some of them never happened at all or never happened with these people. I'm not sure. In any case, right, if I would say so fine, maybe that's true, but still when you read this text, it's trying to give you the feeling of being brought into this intimate situation.
And the editor thought that this was an appropriate set of stories to tell the generations.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. It's still giving the same messages, whether it happened or not. This is the message that's being put down.
Okay, so I want to do two more things today. One is there's this.
Can I also suggest that the language which we've jumped over, which these are psychological descriptions, she was aggressive and forceful, matkift, kifa, these psychological descriptions, of which there are several in this little section you've read us, would be extremely interesting to understand what they thought was good or bad or interesting, worthy behavior. Or in other words, they are describing here the psychological understanding of what constituted certain kinds of behavior. Like we use the word, aggressive or anxious or these kind of fashionable words today because those are the words of the moment, but they had their own psychological language of the time. And interpretive language, and it would be fascinating, to understand what in fact they meant by that. So the peas and the lentils are examples of contrarian behavior, but this other stuff is abstract language of what they consider to be, you know, either blessed or unblessed behavior or appropriate behavior. And it seems that there's something worthwhile to dig into those words, very few words, but, you know, very pointed words about what they thought about a marriage and how you needed to survive in it.
I think thank you. I appreciate that a lot. I think, right, so maybe I'll try and speculate about that for a second, right? Matif Kifa, right? She's they translate as aggressive, right? And many of us are probably familiar with like sort of a discourse around like calling women aggressive and what would you call a man who acted the same way? Maybe you'd call them assertive. Maybe that's a different activity, right? But Matif literally kind of means strong. I don't know what really it kind of refers to there, but I think it may harken back a little bit to what we saw last time, which is, right, when both people are kind of sticklers for their own dignity, you can have a conflict, right? And that may be kind of what's happening here. And we may be sympathetic to a woman in this like sort of historical situation who wants to stand up for her. It could be that like being a stickler for your own dignity means like trying to have any at all. I don't know, but it's still raising that as sort of a trade-off in a potentially interesting way. I wanted to read this midrash. I think she published it in a book called Dear Shuni, or it's published in a book called Dear Shuni, which is like a women's midrash, contemporary midrash. Usually I like roll my eyes at like people writing contemporary midrash. I mean, that's on me. You can like it, but I happen to really like this, and I think that it's very interesting. So remember, we started this passage with Motzeani Marmi Mavet Etesha. I find women more bitter than death. And we started with Rav's wife, who always bakes the wrong thing. So she kind of like does what I think is maybe under the surface of the text, but really not there, which is, well, like the wife is also a person and she probably has a perspective. So what might her perspective be? And I want to sort of, first of all, read this here. I think it's sort of like for sometimes with these sort of texts about that feel very much like a very male space. Sometimes, you know, you can find within the text echoes of something and you can pull out a voice that hasn't been there. And sometimes it really feels like you have to add that voice yourself. So I think this might be one of those situations, and she really tries to do that in, I think, a very interesting way. I wrote this translation, so sorry if it's not so beautiful, but I tried. And so she sort of goes through a series of things. Maybe does anybody want to read it? Maybe in English?
I can be the reader if you like.
Great, thank you.
So you're talking about number 4 right there inside the box, right?
It's titled Marmi Mavet, more bitter than death, right? More bitter than death is a good English translation for what she's going to do with that phrase, actually. Okay.
Rav's wife would serve him peas when he would request lentils, and lentils when he would request peas. And regarding matters like this, they said, and I find a woman more bitter than death. Why so extreme? Was it not because sometimes Rav would say to her that he would come home early from the study hall, and he would come home after nightfall, and his wife would sit forlorn and wait for him until her wrath and anger would be riled up against him. And sometimes he would tell her he would be home late, and he would come before his time, and his wife would rush to and fro to prepare his meal. And not because sometimes he would hint to her that they would eat together alone.
I should be alone, sorry.
Alone. And he would come from the study hall with many disciples, and they would sit and enjoy.
They would sit and enjoy.
Got that.
Yeah.
And this one would labor to serve them all. And they would move their mouths with wise and sharp words, and in the end, bless God. And sometimes he would say that he would bring guests to the meal, and she would stand and cook and prepare a nice feast, and in the end, he would come by himself. Rather, because when Rav knew that his wife had cooked peas, he would ask for lentils. And he would ask for peas when he knew she cooked lentils. And this one would be quiet and not say anything to him. She just gave him what was ready in the pot. And the poor woman did not know why or what for her husband did this to her. Wasn't he her whole world and her whole work? Therefore, she was bitter and embittering all the time, and she almost asked to die. And regarding these, her friend said to her, and I find a woman more bitter than death.
Okay, so the central...
She's turning it on her head. She's turning it on her head, saying, I find being a woman more bitter than death.
I am a bitter woman. I am an embittered person, right? Not bitter to the person who tastes me, as it were, but myself, my experience is bitter, right? Like call me Mara, like Naomi says, right? Like I'm bitter. Now, like that's not the pshat, because then it would be marami mother, right? I don't know, maybe, but I think, but right, certainly in English it actually works very well, right? More bitter than death could be bitter to the beholder or bitter to yourself, right? And that switcheroo accompanies a larger switcheroo of perspective, which is, right, she's doing the opposite of what she said to him or what he wanted, but maybe he's also been doing the opposite this whole time, right? Maybe he always says he's going to do one thing and does another thing, and then he's such a stickler for her about this tiny difference between two different legumes, right? And so, like, yeah, either from like a historical or even like an in the text literary perspective, there's no evidence of any of this, but I think it's kind of right, the same facts could be read in many ways, right? And maybe, right, if we take this back into the Gemara, what it should have asked Rav to do is to try and read the same facts in a different way, right? Think about, why is she doing that, or what could it mean, right? And in some ways, what his son tries to do is a little bit like that, right? His son isn't fully able to like take the perspective of his wife, but he kind of is, because he's able to say like, well, I don't want to change diapers. I know they didn't use diapers then, but whatever, right? Like, I don't want to be doing that, right? Like, I get that her life is not awesome. It's not like she's like living this awesome life and tormenting me at my expense, right? Like, it's kind of like, yeah, this is hard for both of us. And like, even though he's trapped in this like reductive view of what their relationship could be, he's also trying to kind of take her view at least a little bit, I think. Even though he frames it as they raise our sons and save us from sin, right? It's like them and us, right? The other thing that happened, right, was Susan sort of stressed this when she read it. They say about the women, blah, blah, blah. They sort of the male authors of the text or whatever. But her neighbors will say this. And we actually met neighbors last time also, right? Sort of the woman's neighbors who encourage her to go spit in Rebbe's face. So like, right, there's something about, it's not just even this man and this woman, but sort of there's a whole community of people whose voices are absent, who, if we include them, what might we see? Okay.
But, in all of this, the wife and the husband never talks. The husband never asks what Baba said, which was, why are you doing this? I mean, in all these years, he could have said to her, why do you always do the opposite? It's
right.
Like they're in separate realms.
For sure. And I think, yeah, I mean, even Rabbi Chia, he never says to his wife, why you're so annoying, or, hey, I really appreciate you. He's sort of trying to use these like other languages where like, I got you something. And she might be like, that's so annoying. All I want is for you to ask me how my day was. We don't know what she likes, right? So like, I think that, yeah, there is a fundamental lack of any communication between the spouses, right? Even in the Rav story, it's sort of, right, it gets better when they're even more disconnected, when they're not speaking directly to each other at all. Like, there's sort of, there's no time when nobody even yells at her, right? They don't even get angry at each other. They're just like living in separate worlds. And I think that, although there's the hint, right, of, the woman who's both like bitter and beloved, that, what does it say? Me'avram b'mila, she was easily appeased. I mean, she was appeased b'mila, probably with words, but I'm not sure.
Do you think it's at all significant though, that maybe they're, reflecting the other kinds of statements in the Gemara, that it is not appropriate to al tarbe sicha im ha'isha, that it wasn't okay to have a heart-to-heart with your wife?
I don't know if it really wasn't okay. I mean, maybe these people acted that way, right? That like, that's not what wives are for. Wives are not for being your confidant and sort of a person you have a real relationship with. But at least for us as the reader, maybe we can read this as sort of question that, meaning like, and how did that work out for you? Right? Like, not always so well.
Well,
okay.
Are there any examples that would show the kind of relationship that we would think is a positive married relationship? In other words, is this the norm? Or is there some hint that this is not the norm? So far, all we see is them and us kind of relationship.
So I guess I had this problem in, I teach a class with some of these stories in high school. I'm a high school teacher. And like, at some point, one of the students was like, what is the point of this class? I feel like all we learn about is how people like hate their wives. And I was like, oh, I guess I should probably like reconsider what stories I'm teaching. I think there is diversity. Like, I think that first of all, like I said, the first class, I think this is true, right? Sometimes the things that make better stories are the things that have more dysfunction, right? There's like more to unpack there. But that said, like there are certain very famous stories of, you know, like rabbis and their wives having a much more collaborative relationship, right? Rabbi Meir and Bruria, when his sons die, and she kind of, or a few experiences of Bruria sort of like being in the role of Rabbi Meir's teacher. Ima Shalom and Rabban Gamliel, Ima Shalom also is sort of in the role of a teacher. I mean, it's interesting in both of those stories that, maybe we'll learn at least one of them, in both of those situations, the way the wife sort of gains status and respect is by becoming an interlocutor in Torah, right? And sometimes it's emotionally sensitive Torah, right? Like, how do you deal with people who are bothering you, but maybe without asking for them to die? What do you do when you suffer tragedy? So it's like, you know, there is an emotional valence to it, but not always. There are certainly, I don't know what the norm is. I think it probably was a very gender segregated society, right? In which, like, yeah, it's very expected that your closest relationship is your chavrusa, not your wife, or whatever it is. But I think, I'm not ready to say the norm, other than in contemporary societies in which there are cultures in which there are similar expectations or lack thereof about sort of how stratified your society is, right? Some people have great relationships anyway, and some don't. And I think
maybe Rabbi, sorry, I was going to say maybe Rabbi Meir was a different kind of person, because, you know, even though he was a communicator, he had a relationship with his Rebbe, you know, Elisha ben Avuya, who left, you know, the fold. He communicated with everyone, it seems.
Right, meaning, yeah, but I think that's to his credit, and even from the perspective of the Talmud, that would be to his credit. I'm not sure. This is already outside of my depth, but like, if you'll notice, we're talking about Amoraim here. I don't know if there's like an Eretz Yisrael Bavel. I have heard that there's sort of the social status of women is lower in Bavel than in Eretz Yisrael, in which case, like, maybe there's a reason that we find these sort of more equal relationships among the Tanaim in Eretz Yisrael than we do here. And maybe actually that's part of what was going on in our story last week, when a guy from Bavel shows up in Eretz Yisrael and marries a woman, and like they have different expectations about the level of communication that is appropriate in the marriage. I don't know. That was speculation, but possible. Okay, so the last thing I want to do, and I think we have enough time for it. I want to pick up on the thread of Dayenu shemegadlot et benenu matzilot otanu min havira. Right, it's enough for us that our wives save us from sin, and I will. This story is also going to be an unhappy story, so it is noted. Now I'll try and I'll do something less unhappy next time. I didn't promise actually happy, right? So here we have a long sugya. It's in Kiddushin. It starts with a discussion of sort of like how should you keep people separate, yichud, kind of like, you know, and these stories about, you know, traveling, if men and women are traveling together, like how can you make sure that the women are inaccessible to the men overnight? And okay, so then there's a series of rabbis who, this Rabbi Akiva story that we're about to read is the third in a series. They're all similar, slightly different from each other, but like one is enough for our purposes. Then there's the story of Polimo, which I love, but we're going to have to read quickly. And it's going to get us to the story of Rabbi Chia bar Ashi, not the same Rabbi Chia as far as I know. I think like it feels like everyone was named Chia or Abba back in the day. So that's okay. And where we have a situation of sort of like the underlying question here is, like I was trying to say before, what happens when women become associated with sin or lack thereof, even within your marriage, right? So the first thing is sort of not within a marriage. So Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Akiva used to mock sinners, right? He was sort of like, you know, we've met people like this who sort of like, they see somebody doing something that they sort of consider wrong or inappropriate, and they're like, oh my God, can you believe that guy? Right? Like, I just saw somebody take off his tefillin and put them on the floor of the bathroom. This just happened. Somebody said that to me the other day, right? Like, yeah, that is a little shocking, I guess, but also like, I don't know, maybe he doesn't know better or whatever. So he would sort of mock sinners, right? Yom echad, id mile Satan k'itata. So one day, Satan was like, oh, you think you're so hot, right? Well, Satan, so here Satan is like personified, whether he's an actual force. I mean, Satan certainly appears as an actual third-party force in the Gemara in several places. What you think about that in terms of like the actual cosmology, I actually am not, I don't know. You could think whatever you want, whether it's like a metaphor or not. I don't know. Okay. So Yom Echad, so Satan appears like a woman. Bereish Dikla, at the head of a tree. He's not the head, like the top of a tree. She's sort of like sitting up on top of a tree. And Rabbi Akiva doesn't stop to think like, why would a beautiful woman be sitting in the top of a palm tree, right? He's like, oh, beautiful woman, right? This is like, that moment in all these like old sexist cartoons where the guy's eyes go like, oh. So then he, Nakte Ladikla Vikasalika, so he starts climbing the tree, right? What's his intention?
To get to
we
the
don't
top.
know. To get to the top of the tree. What's he going to do when he gets there?
Approach her by halves every time, like the old joke. No.
Maybe he's got some. It seems like he's intending on some sort of interaction with her that he would be embarrassed to talk about the next day. The exact parameters maybe are a little unclear, but like that's sort of the most charitable reading of it. Okay. So, and also, right, there's sort of like a little bit of a phallic image, right? He's like climbing this big tall tree, and he's like going up and up. So then the other ones are also like this, like people are sort of climbing things. Okay. So, and we're going to see that again. So, Kimata Lapalge, the Dikla, right? He gets to the middle of the tree, Shavke, Satan kind of releases him, right? It's like he transforms back into the actual evil devil, right? He's like this beautiful woman, and then it's like, and he's like, haha, see who I really am? I feel like this would be like very well portrayed in a cartoon. Amar, and he said, if I didn't know that they talk about you in heaven, he's a Haruba Rabbi Akiva, be careful about Rabbi Akiva, the Torah and his Torah, meaning that like you kind of have protexia from heaven because of your Torah, right? Shavite ledamach tarte mai. So it's interesting how to read this, right? It's either I would value you at 2 cents, or I would have made you worth 2 cents by not letting you go in the middle, right? Basically, like I could have gotten you to go all the way, right? I let you go halfway, but I didn't have to. It was a favor, right? That I did for you because up in heaven they seem to think that you're worthwhile. I don't know why. You don't seem so worthwhile to me, right? So that's sort of it's one of a series of stories in which rabbis scoff at sinners, right? And it turns out, right, what seems to be the message of the story?
Scoffing at sinners, and then they sin themselves.
Yeah. There, but for the grace of God, go I, right? You could be in their position very easily, right? Don't think that you're better than them, okay? So like, from a contemporary perspective, it's always important to wonder, right? Like, what does it mean when any woman that you encounter on the street could really be Satan in disguise, right? Like, what does that do for your relationships? I think it's like, some people still talk about it this way now, and I think it creates perhaps some unfortunate dynamics, let's say, but it seems like, right, again, this is very much like in the head of the male protagonist of these stories. He's kind of like, wow, I guess this is harder than I thought, right? Like, it's not so easy to be Rabbi Akiva, basically. It's part of the reason I've been so pure till now is that I've been lucky. Okay, so we have these stories of Satan appearing as an attractive woman. Now we're going to have a story. This story really deserves, it's not about marriage relationships at all. So I'm going to do it quickly. This story deserves a careful reading. So Rabbi Avi Killip, who teaches at Hadar, she wrote a post on the Lair House, which is a website / literary Jewish clearinghouse that I'm somewhat associated with, where she writes about this story in the context of some of the upheavals on the Upper West Side about where to house homeless people during the coronavirus epidemic. And so you'll see why. I had thought about this story also. I like to teach at the beginning of the year for Yom Kippur. It happens on Arab Yom Kippur, as we'll see. I thought about it in that connection also, but she wrote it up. I didn't actually read the whole thing, but I think it's, it could be worth your while. So Polemo, who's a guy, the Koran, I took it out because I have no reason to believe that this is true. And it says the sage Polemo. I don't know that Polemo is a sage. He's a guy. He seems to be a wealthy guy. He used to say every day, Gira be'ene desitna. So he's like one step above Rabbi Akiva, because Rabbi Akiva mocks sinners, and Polemo seems to be aware that Satan could come for him, but he's like, well, if I stay vigilant, that won't happen. Okay, Gira be'ene desitna is sort of like a poo, where like keep Satan away from me. Okay, Yom Echad, Male, one day on Erev Yom Kippur, and Id Mele not Ke'itata, he appears not as a woman, but as a poor person. I'm going to maybe just read an English text, right? He atakarva, so he comes to the gate, and they give him bread. And he says, on a day like today, you're really just going to make me eat on the curb, right? This is sort of like how poor people got food, right? They didn't sit out collecting money. It was not as much of a cash-based economy. They went to people's doors and they got food, right? Which still happens in some places now, right? So they go and get food and they bring him bread, which seems to be like the standard practice. And he's like, really, you're going to make me eat alone outside on Erev Yom Kippur, right? This is so, so they're like, okay, fine, come inside. So they bring him inside and he seems like he's sitting in like the pantry. And he's like, really? You're going to make me sit in the pantry when everyone else is in the dining room? They're like, okay, fine, come sit at the table. So he comes to sit at the table. And then it turns out, right, so far, how has Polimo behaved, right, or his household, right? Like this guy shows up, he basically is like your Erev Yom Kippur mitzvah opportunity. And they're like, okay, we'll give you tzedakah. And then he's like, can I have better tzedakah? And they're like, okay. And he's like, even better than that? They're like, okay, right? It seems like he's doing, well, I don't know. How do we feel about Polimo? Yeah, like he's doing okay. He hasn't done anything wrong. Maybe he could have been more generous at the outset, but at the same time, it seems like he's following like the normal procedures. So, okay. So now we learn maybe why they were a little reluctant, which is actually this beggar is not just a poor guy. He's covered in like sores and boils. He's really gross. He probably smells bad. And he's kind of like picking at them and like there's pus all over his clothes and he's sitting at your dining room table, okay? And so he's doing gross things. They're like, hey, can you sit nicely? Could you stop that? And he's like, okay. So he stops for a second. Then he says, could you pass me a cup? So they pass him like a nice cup because he's with them at the dining room table and he uses it to spit his phlegm into. And at that moment, they're like, this has gone too far. And they somehow like sort of berate him. Right, whatever that means. They get kind of annoyed with him. They don't just say sit nicely, they maybe raise their voice or they get somehow annoyed with him, right? And then Satan kind of like faces like, oh my goodness, I can't believe you've treated me this way. And he dies. And then Polimo, right, so that as if that's not enough, then everybody outside is saying, Polimo killed a man, Polimo killed a man, and Polimo runs and hides in the bathroom, which is really an outhouse, right? So there's like a reversal where this disgusting guy shows up at his table, Polimo isn't nice to them, and now Polimo is in the most disgusting place. Okay, Satan shows up in the bathroom, right? And he says, and I'm not sure who falls before who. They say that Satan falls before Polimo. I'm not sure about that, right? I think it's really Polimo fell before him, right? Maybe Polimo thinks he's a ghost. Maybe Polimo realizes who he is, but he feels terrible, right? He feels like he regrets what he did, it seems, maybe I'm reading too much into that. And so Satan reveals himself, right? Upon seeing that he's suffering. Up above, Satan revealed himself once he saw that Rabbi Akiva was going to do the deed, basically, right? Once he saw that he'd succeeded, he's like, actually, it's me. Hi. Here, he's like, it's almost like he feels bad. Satan is in this like, we're going to see he's in kind of a didactic position. He reveals himself and he says, why did you speak that way? Remember the story started with Polimo used to sort of say, Gira be'ena to Satan, right? An arrow in Satan's eye. And now he's like, why would you say that? Satan has feelings too. Don't talk about poking me in the eye. That's not nice. And he says, well, what should I say? Meaning like, in some ways he's like, look, you've just demonstrated to me that you can completely trap me if you want to. I don't like that. What should I say to avoid that? Right? And so Polimo says, the Satan says, you should say, Rahmana nigar be Satan, which is like a play on words because gira be'ain, and now we have nigar be, right? So they sort of sound similar. The same letters have been kind of transformed into something different, which is not, you're going to poke Satan in the eye with an arrow. Here, I'm going to use this hand. But, right, God should sort of put Satan away. Okay, so there's a lot to unpack in that story. I feel like we're not going to read Rabbi Shea bar Ashi. That's okay. We'll do it next time. Okay, so one of the things that I think this series of stories, you just have to take my word for a second, right? The story, I guess we'll read it next time, which will be fine. Sorry about that. I hope this class feels self-contained, even if we didn't get to everything I wanted to. I guess it's like a pattern, right? But, right, one of the things that this whole series, right, you have 3 rabbis who are chasing beautiful women who turn out to be Satan. You have all these stories about people traveling and like, there's a story about like sort of, it's not Satan, it's like actually they're traveling with a group of women and somebody puts like some, you know, they take away the ladder to the attic so that the men can't go up. And then somebody tries to like, and it's a big ladder, so you would need more than one person. So they're supposed to be like, you know, nobody can do it. And then like one of the rabbis kind of finds this superhuman strength to reach to pick up the ladder. Again, this kind of like maybe a little phallic symbol and whatever. So then like, right, there's all these stories, and the next story, just take my word for it, is also going to be about sort of men struggling with their sexual temptation. And right in the middle, we have the story of Polimo, who is struggling with Satan. Satan is disguised as somebody, but he's not disguised as an attractive woman. He's disguised as a repulsive man, right? Why? Potentially. Meaning the lesson Satan seems to be trying to teach Rabbi Akiva is you're no better than anybody else. In some ways, that's part of his lesson here, right? Don't think that you can just defeat me. But the thing, right, after you encounter Satan as a beautiful woman at the top of the palm tree, right, what you have to change about yourself is you have to be more vigilant to avoid beautiful women, basically, right? Whereas what you have to change about yourself after you encounter Satan the way Polimo does is you maybe need to be more vigilant to not avoid people, right? To include people and be kind to them and sort of suppress your ordinary instincts of repulsion that are natural, right? It is natural to think it's disgusting if somebody is sitting at your table, picking open their boils and spitting on stuff, right? Like we have sort of very visceral reactions to that kind of thing. But that like what Satan there, in some ways, what Satan is asking you to do is actually like see them for a person despite that, right? And sort of respect their personhood despite that, right? And one thing that I think is, it can be both a counterweight and not a counterweight, right? If every woman you see is Satan, right, you should stay away. But at the same time, right, maybe sometimes Satan is the person who you want to stay away from, but you shouldn't, right? So on the one hand, the Gemara kind of bifurcates them, right? Where like the person that you want to stay away from shouldn't is male, there's no issue of sexual temptation, and he's actually repulsive. But it could be at least opening up the possibility that, right, one of the things you have to overcome in yourself is the sort of the closedness or the unwillingness to be in a relationship with somebody. I know I'm probably like reading a little too much, but I don't think that much too much, right? That like there's, right, the story of Polimo is like, Polimo is sort of a very, he's like, you know, a nice guy. He's an ordinary person. He's not, that's the way I see it. He's a person who self-identifies as upper middle class, right? Like all of America, right? So like, he's upper middle class, he's living there, he has a nice house, and he's, yeah, like he doesn't actually want this gross guy there, but he's not gonna say no because he knows it's the right thing to do until it really becomes too much for him to bear. And the message to him is actually like, you need to really push yourself out of your comfort zone in order to sort of help someone else. So maybe part of what I want to say is like, can we take that message back into the interactions with women in these stories? And I think in the story that I guess we'll do next time about Rabbi Chia bar Abba and his wife, who it starts off similar to these other things, right? Where like, you know, sort of a rabbi is tormented by sexual temptation and really trying to avoid it, but that like, it's also, full disclosure, kind of like a tragic ending, but that story, I think, really will kind of open the possibility that there was another path, similar to maybe there was another path for Rav and his wife if he had just said, hey, why do you keep making peas instead of lentils, right? Maybe there's another path if he had sort of brought to bear the kind of seeing her full humanity the way that Satan asked you to do with the beggar.
So it sounds like Satan's message actually, you identified Satan's message in the previous story as there but for the grace of God go I. Right? That you've been making fun of sinners and you could just as easily be a sinner. Can we see that as a common theme? You know, this guy's got sores. Well, you know, illness happens and you too could become like that. I don't know. I wonder if that's what we ought to be pulling through.
But I think that like, that's certainly, I think that that is an angle on what I was trying to say, but I think that, yeah, thank you for adding that, which is that like, yeah, part of what he's trying to break through for Polimo is like, my status as sort of the householder is secure and I'm doing somebody a favor by letting them in. He's like, no, like actually you're all people and you're all kind of you have to see yourself as in the same boat fundamentally as this person you think is disgusting.
Something I was thinking about with this last Agadah was that it's interesting that Polimo is like, at first he's like, basically just focused on how he can get rid of the devil in his life or the Satan in his life. And then the end of the story is like, the Satan is like, you should reframe it as like, let the merciful one, the merciful one should
Rebuke, they translated it as.
Should rebuke the Satan. And I felt like adding God in to the picture and adding mercy into the picture. It's like the frame is so different. The frame is about serving something positively. The frame is about compassion.
Yeah. That's nice, right? And I think, right, one way to teach this is, right, that like, or to see this is the whole difference, which is a difference of a few letters, is between polemo, right? You're secure in your status, and you're going to overcome Satan on your own, versus you're actually completely insecure. So you're insecure in your ability to overcome Satan, but you're insecure in everything else also. Maybe you could end up like the beggar, who knows, right? And that if you have that recognition, that can help you treat other people more properly. It is 9:02, so I don't want to keep anyone, but I'm happy to keep listening. You're permitted to leave if you want. Yeah.
Oh, I was just going to say, maybe we could recognize that. I think these stories tell us that like Satan is not outside of us, but really there's some part of Satan in us. And, you know, the Satan with polemo is saying, like was just said, that, you know, you need God's help with Satan because he's really in all of us. He's not outside.
Right. I think that's nice. And I think especially in this story, it comes out, right? And it's also, right, like you can do fine up until, right, like polemo, basically the Satan, there's always something that could be worse, that could trip you up, right? Like he passes the first like 5 steps, he's fine. And then he's like, it's just because he can't quite get there. And like, if he had gotten past the thing with the spitting, he would have come up with something else, right? There's always something. It's never like eliminated the possibility of sort of acting against your better judgment or acting on sort of like the worst voices of your nature versus the better. Yeah.
So I don't know how you get away from equating the disgusting, badly behaved man with the beautiful woman. I mean, I know that there are many examples of the Satan appearing all over the place, but even though one is a reaction of disgust and one is a reaction of attraction, it's still the case that you have to juxtapose them and see that a beautiful woman or an attractive woman is the same category of problem as a disgusting, off-putting man. I don't know how you don't, I mean, you as in how the reader cannot be forced to put those two things together.
So I think on the one hand, yes, first of all, in the sense that they're both kind of like objects, right, of your sort of your reaction. And that, so I think that like, I don't know, maybe I bring too many biases to this when I sort of see it as like, right, the fact that the woman is attractive, maybe by putting it in conversation with this polemo story and saying like that actual like, and this actually would fit very well with the story that we didn't read, which we will, is like, right, in some ways you're reacting to your own attraction as repulsive, right? That like being attracted to this woman who's sort of like forbidden to you is itself like something that you basically think is disgusting. And I think that like, I mean, yeah. So like, is your question, I mean, I think like, I will readily acknowledge that like, this creates many problems for those of us who want to like see ourselves in text like this, or otherwise kind of like, feel that they speak to our world. I think that like, I mean, I think that it is in some ways very like authentic to like to really experience sort of like the whole idea of female sexuality as like this huge problem in the world that men have to avoid. So yeah, like, I don't know if I can avoid it, I guess. I may have sort of elided it, but I agree, perhaps.
I think it's a very least it's a mirror image. Even if it's one of them, you know, one of the things that we have to prevent ourselves from being disgusted, and one of them we have to prevent ourselves from being attractive. So that it is not an exact same thing, but it is certainly a mirror image. The Satan behaves in lots of different ways as this objectivization of certain types of human beings. But I'm not even talking about the objectivization issue. I'm just saying that we have these many stories of the Satan appearing. The Satan does not appear as a Talmud Chacham who comes and tells you not to eat treif on Yom Kippur. That's not the way a Satan ever appears. The Satan appears in very specific kinds of generic ways. And this is one of them. One of them is a beautiful woman on top of a tree, and one of them is a horrible man on Yom Kippur. So I just think is a very, I wasn't thinking anything complex in that. Something very simple is that the rabbis are telling you this is the devil. and this is how it appears. So
But
anyway,
actually what you're saying though is that the Satan is appearing in ways that elicit strong emotions from you. And maybe that's the thing that's so scary. Either
Also,
desire or disgust.
that's a
Satan
very
also
generous reading. That's a very generous reading.
Satan also appears, however, like in the story, Midrash around Avraham, and God is sort of tricked by Satan into forcing Avraham to prove his loyalty by offering up Yitzchak. He functions very differently there. I think we have to kind of look at how many different ways Satan is used as a kind of tool to make something clear, or to give a reason for something, or to project yourself or something. It's not always one way or the other, and it's not always about women and disgust and hate.
No, yeah, for sure, not always, but I do think it's true that like it's not an accident, and it's not a one-off. Like I said, even there's 3 stories here, but it's not a one-off thing of like, oh, right, like your struggle in the world as a male rabbi is to sort of like avoid the evil inclination, i.e., women, right? That like that is a real undercurrent, I think, in this story and elsewhere. That like. So it's true. Like what I'm trying to offer is a little bit of an attempted redemption of that, a little bit by saying like, but look at this next story where it's true, right? Like the Satan always appears as a person who's not a rabbi. It's always sort of like an other kind of class, but like we're able to sort of elicit some compassion, or the message seems to be something about compassion for this version of the Satan. Maybe we, the reader, I don't know that the text, but maybe we, the reader, can try and have the similar kind of compassion for the women who are being sort of set up this way as the potential sort of.
What's interesting is that at the end, the Satan reveals himself because he sees Pelemus suffering. It's a real turnaround. Satan is being compassionate.
Right. Satan in this story is not like, right, like in the Avram stories, he's constantly trying to make people suffer, right? Like the more suffering, the better. Right, like, oh, I didn't get you this way, I'll get you some other way. I'll get you next time, my pretty. Right, like, he's kind of like he doesn't let up. Right, like he always, and sometimes you foil him, but that's not because he chose to let up. Right, and here it's kind of like he's playing sort of a didactic role, which I think is, I mean, maybe it's sort of like a blurring of sort of the text is using him to play a didactic role, so they put that in his voice. But I don't know. Yeah. Okay. Thanks all. Thank you very much for your thoughts. I hope I'll see many of you next week. Maybe all.
Thank you. Wonderful.
Thank you, Miriam. Thank you, everyone. I do want to give a quick plug. Our fall programming is going to continue tomorrow at 1 p.m. with a class series by Dr. Dror Bondi on Abraham Joshua Heschel and human dignity as a divine concern. And to please always check out our website, www.drisha.org/classes, for all of the class information and registration. So again, thanks everyone so much, and we'll see you next week.
Bye-bye.